Can the pawn on a2 promote without the king catching him, or is this a draw? Should white resign in this situation, or can we stop this pawn here from promoting on a1? Is this a win for black, or is white able to stalemate the position? Not having all the answers is completely okay and confirms that you were in the right place. Today, we're going to go over the top 5 pawn endgames, including a secret grandmaster tactic that I will show at the end of the video, so that you can turn your losses into draws and your draws into wins. Endgame number 1, square theory. In this situation, we have a simple question. Can the pawn on a2 promote? It is either a win for white or a draw for black. While you could count the squares between the king and a8 as well as the pawn in a8, there's actually a much simpler way of doing this. Here, we can draw a line from a4 to a8 and then draw it down to e8, down to e4, and back around to a4, creating a square. In this situation, if the king doesn't move into the square on his next move, the white pawn can promote. Take a look at this situation here. If we were to play b4, you would then draw a square from b4 to b8, and then you'd once again go all the way around here. You can see that the black king is in that square already and will catch the pawn before going to b8. The best move here is for white to play king c7, blocking the king out and not allowing him to attack the pawn. If king to e6, trying to work backwards to attack the pawn, we play b4. Here, king d5, pawn b5, and you can see that we've actually managed to promote our pawn. The black king cannot catch in time. We are not protected all the way through to promotion. Endgame number 2, pawns on the 6th rank. Now with pawns in the 6th rank, there's a very simple rule. The most important squares are e7, f7, and g7, the 3 squares in front of the pawn. And this situation is white to move, and we can play f7. Here, we are blocking off e8 as well as g8. The king is blocking off g7. The king is actually forced to play e7. Now we can get opposition on g7. This means that on our move, we face the king just like this with 1 square in between, and it is his move, meaning he will either have to move to e8 or e6. Here, e8 is an illegal move because the pawn is defending that square. So really, the only thing to do, king e6, and we can promote to that queen. Now, move order really matters here. If it was black's move here, king g8, and now he has the opposition, we would have to choose whether or not we're going to go to h6 or move backwards. If h6, the king can go to f7 and we cannot protect our pawn any longer. If we move backwards, notice the king can go to f7 and we're never going to be able to get in front of this pawn again, and he controls the crucial 3 squares in front of our pawn on f6. We will never get that back, and it is a draw. In this situation here, you have to be very careful. If you play the wrong move, you are drawing. You have to find king a6. King b6 instead, notice king b8, and we're no longer able to get in front of the pawn. If we were to play c7, the king can jump in front, and here we either have to vacate the defense of the pawn or play king c6, which is actually a stalemate. The king has nowhere to go. The correct move in this position is king to a6. Here, our opponent goes to b8, we continue opposition b6, and after the king moves over to c8, we now have c7. In this situation, it is our opponent's move, not ours, so he is going to have to go to d7. And once he does that, we can play king b7, and now we're going to promote on c8. Our opponent cannot stop us, whites win. As you can see, opposition is very important, but it doesn't guarantee a win or a draw in every situation. Here is white to move, meaning black actually has opposition. However, after king to f5, notice that the black king going to f7 is impossible. The pawn is defending. Here, you would have to play king f8, and now we have opposition on f6. After king to e8, we see the all too familiar position e7, and the king moves over to d7, we will promote. Now when it comes to 6th or 3rd rank pawns, I've taught you that the 3 squares in front are the most important. This is almost always true, but there is one situation where there is an exception, and that exception comes when the king is on the rook's file. Here in this situation, if we play king to h1, the pawn will not be able to promote. If king to f2, it's actually a stalemate. Notice that there is nowhere for the king to go, and this is just a draw. If g2, king g1, and now after king to g3, it is a draw once again. It is a stalemate. There is nowhere to go for the white king. However, do not make this mistake as white. If you play king to g1, then g2 is played, and here the king is forced to go to h2. Now king to f2 is possible, and we will promote, and white loses. Endgame number 3, special squares. We've talked about pawns in the 6th rank, but let's talk about pawns that aren't quite that far yet. The most important squares are not the ones directly in front of him. They are actually 2 ranks above right here, e7, f7, and g7. We will look to take over one of these squares and guarantee the promotion. In this situation here, we can play king to f6, playing opposition. Our opponent will either move to e8 or g8, and no matter where he goes, we now take over one of these 3 crucial squares, and a red carpet opens up on the f-file for the pawn. Now, what's interesting about this position is it doesn't matter whose turn it is. Even if black is to play, it is completely winning for white. Yes, black can play king e8 and get opposition, but here we can play f6. If our opponent moves back to f8, we play pawn f7, and you can see that now our opponent will have to move over and we promote. In this position here, we've gained control of one of the 3 crucial squares, but you have to be careful of stalemating tricks with the king on h8. Therefore, in this situation, we would play king to g6. The whole point here is to try to take control of the h-file and force the king out of this little corner. So of course, our opponent's king will play g8, we play king h6, and here, after our opponent moves over, we can actually play g6. After our opponent moves again, we can play g7, and you've seen this position 100 times. We now promote, game over. Remember, g6 is a stalemate because the king would have nowhere to go. Here it is a race to the 3 most important squares, c6, d6, and e6. We go ahead and play king d5 because no matter what our opponent plays, we will be able to get c6, and now we have one of the 3 crucial squares. If our opponent moves over, we get opposition. He moves over, we move over, and here we create the red carpet for our pawn and we will promote. The key to this situation is tactically figuring out that you will not be able to get to e6 or d6, so playing d5 instead, knowing that c6 will be impossible for black to cover before you get there. In this situation here, we are on defense. We know that our opponent wants one of these 3 squares in order to promote the pawn. Therefore, we go ahead and play not king to b2, but king to b1. This is actually opposition here, because if our opponent goes ahead and plays c4, we can play c2. And the point is, no matter what our opponent does, we are always going to keep him from going to one of these 3 squares. If our opponent pushes the pawn, we go to c2. Now, a big lesson to learn here is as long as we stay in front of the pawn, we are in good shape. One final point is that in this situation, black has opposition, but we can go ahead and take that opposition away from him by simply just playing g4. In this situation, we now have opposition because black needs to move. No matter where he goes, we go ahead and play h6, king moves over, and look, we have opposition. Endgame number 4, the Rooks Pawn. If your opponent has a pawn on h or a, you can actually force a draw here. In this situation, simply king to h1. Notice that our opponent will never be able to stop us from going back and forth from g1 to h1. If he was to play king f2, we go ahead and play h2 and our opponent cannot protect the pawn. If our opponent pushes the pawn, it's a stalemate because there is nowhere to go for us. Now, while this position here is completely impossible, it also articulates the point well. Look, it doesn't matter how many pawns you have on the h-file. Our opponent's up 6 points of material here, but just move over to h1, and in this situation, no matter what our opponent does, it's actually a draw. Now, one final note on the rook pawns. Don't be discouraged if your king is not on the a1 and b1 square to begin with. Like in this situation here, we are trying to chase this pawn. If it's black's turn, yes, king b2, and we cannot stop this pawn from promoting. However, we have the move, and we can play king to c1. The point is, we're stopping the king from getting to b2, which is the most important square on this promotion. In this situation, if the pawn continues to push, we play king to b1, and now we are in that corner, and we will stop our opponent from promoting. If our opponent stops us from going to that corner, we play king c2, and we have opposition. If our opponent goes up, we go up, and we maintain the opposition every step of the way. Our opponent cannot do anything. If our opponent starts to push the pawn, that is fine too. King c1 is perfectly acceptable. If our opponent tries to play king a3, we just go here, and now we have a1, and we are good to go. If our opponent continues to push that pawn down, we can play king c2. Let's say king a1, we move down, pawn a2, and in this situation, our opponent is in king jail. After king to c2, the king cannot move, the pawn cannot move, and this is stalemate, game over. You've escaped with the draw. Endgame number 5, pawn breaks. Pawn breaks are arguably one of the most important tactics that you can possibly understand when it comes to endgames. If you just try getting your king involved in the action, you would think that you can get to this pawn first, but actually king to e7. Here, after king to g6, our opponent plays king to f8, and he's actually going to be able to get a draw. Let's say you push the pawn now. Pawn takes back, and here king to g8. And as we know, black will actually force a draw here. Believe it or not, there is a much simpler way to win. It's just pushing h6. Now, no matter what our opponent does, he is losing. Let's say our opponent takes. We take back. Now we can use a tactic we learned back from the first endgame, square theory. Notice here that our opponent will not enter the square on his next move, meaning that we will promote on h8 and win the game. If the pawn pushes, no big deal. h7 and we're promoting on the next move. If our opponent has 2 pawns to our 2 pawns, this is actually a draw. Notice in this situation, if we were to push either h6 or g6, doesn't really matter. Opponent can just play h6, locking the position. We can't move forward, so we have to go to f5. Our opponent goes to e7, and notice that our opponent will never get to the h-pawn. We will never get to the g-pawn, and this will end up being a draw no matter what you do. You can't get aggressive here. There's just no way of getting to this pawn. Look, even if he retreats all the way into the back, it ends up just being a stalemate since the king has nowhere to go. This position gets very tricky when it comes to 3 pawns, and I'm going to show you a secret grandmaster trick in this situation. Notice that if we play king to d5, thinking, oh look, we're going to get to the pawns first, king c7, and here we can't go to e6, and this is actually a draw. There's only one winning move in this position. It's very difficult to find, g6. Now, you might think, why on earth would you play g6? You end up losing a pawn. Well, if you don't take this pawn, then either pawn takes or pawn takes, and we're going to promote. If you do take the pawn, either with f or let's say h, you don't take back here. You would actually go ahead and play f6. Absolutely brilliant. No matter what your opponent does, you're actually winning. If the pawn takes here, we are now down 2 points of material, but after h6, notice that we are pushing the pawn to victory and our opponent is not. If our opponent takes with the g-pawn, simply just f takes g, and now we are promoting again. This is game over, whites win. Those are the 5 most important pawn endgame tactics that you can use in order to improve your game. For me, these 5 were a huge breakthrough in getting my elo from 1800 to 2000. Being confident in the endgame translates to all aspects of chess and makes you a better player all around. If you did find this video useful, I want you to go ahead and check out this video here on some famous middle game positions. Stay classy, my friends. Until next time.